Good evening. My name is Anthony Smiley, and my persuasion speech is going to be on lifting the embargo against Cuba. On February 7, 1962, John F. Kennedy signed into action the embargo against Cuba. It's still in effect today, and what the effects are the trade between U.S. and Cuba, as well as visas to travel to and from. I'm going to list 4 reasons why the embargo should be lifted. The embargo is a decision based on Cold War thinking. Cuba was allied with the USSR back in 1962 to 1991, but no longer poses a threat as both communist parties have failed. 2. The embargo is impartial to Cuba. Cuba, being communist, is the only country the United States will not trade with or visit, and holds restrictions on both, while we trade with North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, and even Burma. 3. Real changes the embargo has produced. The embargo was expected to deliver a free, democratic Cuba, to restore basic human rights, as well as lift the communist regime and put a democratic government in place. However, the real results it has produced are nothing but, and I will go into those details a little bit later in my presentation. And 4, the embargo protects the Castro regime against admitting any faults within their government. Once more, I'll get into these details as my speech continues. A brief history on the embargo. As mentioned before, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy armed democratic rebels in Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion. However, that failed. That same year, President Kennedy received information from a spy plane that USSR, or the Soviet Union, was transporting nuclear arms to Cuba. At this time, he made the decision to place the embargo on Cuba, therefore encasing it in what would be known as a freeze time. The embargo has been in effect for 54 years, and despite over a half a century, not much has been accomplished, with the exception of a lot of downfalls and villainization of the United States on a world theater. Point 1. The Cold War era thinking. Cuba's relationship ended with the Soviet Union in 1991 when the Communist Party failed. The $3 billion it received in aid from the USSR was no longer coming to Cuba, forcing them to go different avenues for economic growth. Hence, miniature tourism with other countries, with the exception of the United States, due to the embargo. Cuba does not pose a military threat. Pentagon released in 2011 that Cuba did not have the military means to create a direct threat to the United States. There is an unrealistic fear of communism spreading to the Western Hemisphere due to the Communist Party here. So the threat of communism spreading is null and void. And the embargo, as mentioned before, is over half a century old and has yet to yield any favorable results that President John F. Kennedy intended for. It is hypocritical to single out Cuba to hold sanctions against trade and travel, while the United States trades with Venezuela, China, Vietnam, and even open up visas for tourism in North Korea. All of these countries of which have a poor track record for human rights, and many abuse rights and political prisoners to add on top of that. The United States also accepts visas for individuals from the U.S. to travel to Burma, Iran, and other countries that support terrorism open and directly. So for the United States to go ahead and withhold the Cuba to a different standard is hypocritical and makes the United States look weak in the world theater. What the embargo actually achieved. Due to the embargo, Cuba is still in the technological age of 1960. It denies the access to the modern age of technology. denies medicine. Doctors in Cuba estimate that 50% of medicine used here in the US cannot be used in Cuba due to the holding of US patents, meaning the Cuban people suffer because of the embargo. It denies access to commercial goods and foods. Cubans work for 1/24 the pay due to the communist regime. The goods that they can procure are nothing to the extent that we have around the world, let alone the United States. By lifting the embargo, not only do we send a message for democracy and change through capitalism, but we also send a message to the Castro regime that the people want more out of life than 1/24 the pay. The embargo failed its goal. Cuba has not recognized any other government party. It still only recognizes its own Castro communist regime. All other political parties, to include Democratic, Third Party, and what have you, are imprisoned. There are over 6,000 prisons in Cuba that hold political prisoners to this day. Cuba has met the people's uproar for a democratic change with imprisonment. And Cuba has failed to restore basic human rights. While this is deplorable, these are not reasons to hold Cuba onto an unfair standard to other countries worldwide. Assigning blame. Lifting the embargo addresses problems that Cuba has against the United States. Cuba could no longer blame its economical state on the embargo from the US. It could not blame the failing healthcare system of Cuba on the United States, as well as the outdated infrastructure, which leads to water poisoning because of 50-year-old pipes. Without the embargo in place, Cuba would have to address, or the Communist Party of Cuba would have to address its people and explain why it has failed its people as a whole. There have been many presidential attempts to end the embargo. In 1997, Jimmy Carter's secret talks with Castro led to the result of the 1980 Mariel boat lift, which you would recognize from the movie Scarface. It sent 125,000 Cubans into the United States, of which 25,000 were prisoners, and the rest were against his political regime. 1995, President Clinton relaxed travel restrictions with the wet foot, dry foot policy, which states Cubans that are leaving Cuba that are caught out at sea, wet feet, would be returned. And dry foot, if they came in and landed on Florida, they'd be granted immunity as well as citizenship. In 2004, Bush increased the strength of the embargo due to the 9/11 attacks and strengthened the country's security measures. But which led to 2011 presidential Obama lessening the travel restrictions, and once more, 2014, Obama did something that presidents haven't done since pre-John F. Kennedy, which was restore full diplomatic relations. In conclusion, the Cuban embargo is an outdated mindset. The Cold War is long over, and we need to move forward. The U.S. trades with every other type of government, communist or terrorist, with the exception of Cuba, which is hypocritical worldwide. The Cuban people pay the price. While the regime is holding steadfast, the people are the ones that don't receive the medicine or technology that they need to be in a modern world. The U.S. wouldn't be to blame for Castro's failed communist government. This past Saturday, Fidel Castro, former leader of Cuba, passed away, and hopefully with him, he took his animosity toward the United States, and his brother Raul Castro can move forward with President Obama to relieve the embargo placed on Cuba. If everything goes well, Cuba will once again enter the world theater as a nation with fair and just trading and travel restrictions lifted.